Okay, I think it's time to start. Welcome, everybody. Sam, can I ask you to share the slides as you are sharing your screen? Great. Well, welcome, everybody, to the Talkwalker in LexisNexis webinar. This is the schedule for today. So we're going to give you an introduction into crisis management and also give you a demo of Nexis Social Analytics. And at the end of the webinar, you will have time to ask your questions. So this is the team for today. So that's me, Minke Koman. I'm the marketing manager for LexisNexis in the Benelux. And I'm joined today by Igor Sinicic and Sam Cookney. Igor is a senior partner manager at Talkwalker. Hello, Igor. And he will be managing the Q&A. So if you have a question during the webinar, please put it in the Q&A and we will get back to those questions at the end of the webinar. And Sam will tell you more about crisis management today, and he will also give you the demo. Could you show the next slide? Yes, thank you. So as LexisNexis is hosting this webinar, I want to tell you a little bit more about what we do in case you don't know us. So LexisNexis is part of RELX, a global publishing company, and we've been around for a while, more than 40 years. And we offer a very large collection of data. So that's news, business information, market information, legal information. And all that content is put into a database, and we offer solutions around those built on the database. There are just a few examples here. So there's, for example, Nexis Social Analytics and Nexis News Desk, which are both media monitoring solutions. So you can use these to monitoring what is being said about your company in the media. We have Nexis, which is our research solution, and people use it to write articles or to do competitive intelligence. It's also possible to integrate our data into your own solutions through an API. That's Nexis DaaS, which is data as a service. And finally, another example is Nexis Diligence, which is very relevant at the moment because it's a tool you can use for third-party screening. So it also contains, for example, sanctions information. So all that data that we collect, the data on its own may not always be that valuable. So we have an enrichment process in place, which adds tags into that data. So it makes it easier for us to handle it, but also easier for people who use our solutions to find what they're looking for. And that enriched data is the basis for all our solutions. And we have solutions in 4 different segments. That's media intelligence, which also contains media monitoring, research, data as a service, and risk and compliance. Could you go? Yes, thank you. And what is also good to know is that the data in our database is not just any data. We collect data from publishers around the world. So a lot of it is licensed content. So that means we have a license for publishing it. And sometimes we even have an exclusive partnership, like the partnership we have with DPG and Media House, which are the 2 largest publishers in the Netherlands. So their content is in our database and also in Nexis Social Analytics, for example. And Nexis Social Analytics is also a partnership between LexisNexis and Talkwalker. So that's why we're hosting this webinar today, the 2 of us. Talking about Talkwalker, Sam, could you please talk a bit more about your company?
Sure thing. Thanks, Minke, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining on this Thursday before Easter. And firstly, just apologies if I sound a little nasal today. The hay fever season has hit London early this year, and I've just been hit by a morning of sneezing. So hopefully I'll manage to get through this without sneezing too much. But super. So a quick introduction to Talkwalker and who we are. So we started life back in 2009 as a web crawling technology. And at the time, we really started focusing our research and development into artificial. And within that, specifically, the ability to analyze unstructured conversations. What that's meant today is that we're now the leading consumer intelligence company globally. We have 11 offices. I'm based here in the London office here in the UK, which we opened just last year. And we have a team of over 650 experts. I think it's important to mention that actually a third of the team is made up of data scientists, which really just shows you the commitment that we have to artificial intelligence and actually helping brands extract insights from this data, which really helps us bring brands closer to their consumers. How we do that is through what we call this 360-degree view on the consumer's world, understanding everywhere that consumers are talking about your brand. So in terms of some of those areas that we're monitoring online, so first of all, we have obviously the major social networks like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and so on and so forth. We have external data. You could bring in trend data. We have things like blogs, forums, online news, podcasts, print radio, and so on and so forth. And we do that across 187 languages in 196 countries. We track your owned media. So that could be your own Facebook pages, Instagram pages, LinkedIn pages, and so on. We track media. So that's all those third-party mentions online, whether it's social, online media, for example. And we can also track your paid media. So if you're doing campaigns on Twitter, Facebook, and so on. Interestingly, it's not just text as well. So we are also searching the web for images and videos. So we can also track things like brand logos and scenes where your logo is appearing. And that's really important because there are estimates that around 2/3 or online don't actually mention a brand. So maybe someone's posting a photo on Instagram of an issue they're having perhaps in one of your shops or with a product, but they don't actually tag you in the photo. We can still identify the logo within that photo. Similarly, if someone's posting a selfie on Twitter outside one of your stores, we can identify the brand logo in that tweet, even if they haven't mentioned you or mentioned your brand in the actual tweet itself. What we also bring in is internal customer data as well. So this could be your first-party data like reviews online, surveys, feedback, website analytics, also what we call business impact metrics. So if you want to correlate any of your internal metrics like sales, website visits, leads, for example, and just understand if that correlates or not to your online mentions or perhaps things like positive sentiment for the brand. And how do brands use this data? So we have what we call our PMP Framework, which stands for Protect, Measure, and Promote. Really the three main groups for how brands use this online and social data. And today we're going to be looking at two in particular, which is the issue tracking and crisis management use cases. And these sit firmly within the how do we protect our brand and also manage our reputation online use cases. So how do we go about analyzing a crisis? We determine there's really three levels of crises that you might face as a company. Level one really being the most severe. This is what we call potential for disaster. This could be a product recall, it could be a corporate issue, theft, negligence, something that's very serious. And the common thread here is that you're going to face negative media mentions across the board, whether it's press, social media, news, TV, radio. And as a response, you also have to be multi-channel in those communications back. So post an apology on your website, on social media, talk to your journalists in the press, arrange broadcast interviews, and so on. Level two is what we call the day-to-day potential crises. These could be customer complaints, they could be criticisms. They're things that could be dealt with quickly before they escalate into disaster. And depending on where that comment occurred, really determines whether the issue can be handled one-to-one, perhaps in a direct message, or maybe more publicly. But the key to stopping these complaints and potential crises in their tracks is to be monitoring online constantly with social listening. So you catch these issues early and you can respond quickly. Level three is what we call these indirect crises. This could be, for example, something that happens to one of your competitors, or maybe something wider in your industry that's happening. And by association, it's possible that your brand reputation may also be brought into this. Similar to level two, the preparation for this is constant monitoring, but not just of your own brand, that of your competitors, and also general industry themes as well. So you're constantly on top of what's going on. So how do we go about preparing for a crisis? Step one is assembling what we call your crisis response team. So firstly, there should be a list, everyone who should be notified when a crisis strikes. That list just makes sure you don't miss anyone when a crisis does kick off and you're obviously under stress and kind of moving very quickly. You need a chain of command and an approval process. Ideally, the CEO should be leading the crisis team, along with your head of PR or maybe communications, and also head of legal. Figure out in advance who's going to be the spokesperson for your company. Make sure that person is obviously media trained and is capable and happy to go on to TV, radio, and speak on behalf of the company. Make sure you know who's leading the communications. This ideally should be a combination of marketing, social, and PR teams, all prepared, and crucially, all using the same voice and the same messages throughout those communications. And this is why it's so important to have a crisis management plan in place. So you're going to have a checklist, make sure you know exactly what needs to be done. I like to think of this as how a pilot would have a checklist before they go onto a plane, just to make sure that everything has been prepared, ticked off, and you've not missed anything that might be overlooked. This is even more important, I think, during a crisis when, again, you're under stress, things are moving very quickly, and it's very easy just to miss something. So having that checklist in place just makes sure that you tick every box there. Make sure you have all the contact details of everyone who needs to be involved, clearly listed out, including mobile numbers, out of office hours, and so on. Keep running media lists. So you have on hand your list of industry experts, maybe friendly journalists who've written about you before, ones that you know. Key influencers as well, people who are already posting about your brand and may be able to be there to support you. And also any lawyers that you might need to look over messaging. On that point, it's important to have draft messaging frameworks and templates in place. This could be frameworks for press releases, social media posts, interview Q&As, for example, and have any holding statements drafted as well so that they're ready for quick approvals. But what do we need before we actually speak to the media? And the key here is to make sure you have the right data, the right intelligence, and the right facts in place. As I mentioned earlier on, the first key step is really monitoring on an ongoing basis, monitoring online social media. And this also isn't just for crisis situations. A good social listening strategy will also not just pick up negative trends, but also help you catch positive user-generated content, customer product feedback, for example, audience sentiment, and so on and so forth. And all that information is really important in helping you create your marketing and communication strategies and messaging. So some of the things you might want to look at tracking on an ongoing basis, I think the most important is obviously, first of all, your brand. So that could be any brand mentions, it could be @mentions on Twitter, photo tags on LinkedIn, and so on and so forth. Anyone talking about your brand. It could be trending topics. So what's happening today? You know, does your team kind of log on to Twitter every morning and just look at those top themes, top news stories, and see, is this something that could potentially affect us today? Tracking your key influencers. What are they talking about? They're usually first with the news. Are they mentioning some of your competitors before? But industry hash.
Minka, is it me or did Sam freeze a little bit?
I see it too. Oh.
Oh.
Did we lose Sam?
Apologies, guys. I think my internet just dropped. Can you?
Oh.
Am I still here?
You're back.
You're
but
back.
Apologies
for the
that.
last minute, we haven't seen you. So
Apologies for that. I've just turned off my camera. I saw Minka, you'd frozen, and I thought maybe it was you, but it turns out it was me. So my apologies for that. Where did I leave you, Igors?
about the competitors and so on, yeah.
Okay, perfect. I think we're all up to date then. Super. So the next step was then to actually source this information online. So what sort of media types should we be looking at? And really, it's anywhere your brand might be being mentioned. So that could be obviously social media, depending on whether you're B2B or B2C. That may involve Instagram, it could be LinkedIn, whichever social platforms are most relevant for you. I think often overlooked but super important is things like blogs, forums, review sites. Most brands have no idea that all these conversations are taking place on Reddit, Mumsnet, these huge forums that have millions of people each month reading them. Broadcast media, print media, it could be things like podcasts, for example, anywhere your brand's being mentioned. And so once you've gathered all that data, the key is then just to make sure you have all the facts in place before communicating. So never speculate. As we've seen on so many occasions, if a brand hides its mistakes, if it sort of bends the truth, it will eventually get found out, and that brand reputation will be damaged as a result. So be as transparent as you can, tell the truth, tell people what you're going to do, how you're going to rectify the situation, and how you'll make sure it doesn't happen again. So now we then need to take action. And the first step, fairly obviously, is apologizing. So that's taking responsibility for the situation and, crucially, not deflecting blame onto anyone else, but keeping it factual, responding quickly. This is also important. So in the absence of communications from a brand, people will start to speculate. So make sure that you're communicating fast, so there's no vacuums in communication or information coming here. Make sure you keep your media lists updated. So journalists are constantly moving. Make sure you have updated media lists so you know who to contact when something does happen. Share your crisis response as a blog post. This is always super interesting because that way you're sharing your messaging in a more casual, friendly voice that an audience can relate to, rather than just a very informal sort of wire service press release, which can sometimes be a bit impersonal if you're sharing sensitive messaging. If you can, record live broadcasts. And as I mentioned before, distribute that messaging where your stakeholders are going to see it. So, if you are active on Twitter, post there. If you have a very active blog, post there, and so on. And then finally, after the crisis, just sort of reflect on what you've seen and work out how can we do this better next time. So what worked well, what didn't work well? What sorts of types of data should we be looking at? That could include media data, so just doing a retrospective on who wrote about the crisis, whether individual bloggers, journalists, sites you should be focusing on from now on. What happened with your competitors? Did they reference it in any way? Did it affect them? How did they handle the situation? Was your financial data impacted, whether it's stock price, sales, website visits? And then ordinary consumer data. So what are people online saying about the brand? How has their perception changed over time? Has sentiment around the brand changed? Are there any new hashtags or emerging themes as a result of this? With that, let's jump straight into the platform, and I'll give you a quick demo of what all this looks like in a live platform. Now, what we're looking at here is an example of issue tracking for a global beverage brand. And we're looking at all their mentions online over the past 3 months, where some of their key topics are mentioned. You see we've defined these topics here. So things like financial performance, health issues, could be CSR initiative, consumer opinions, conversations around the ingredients in this beverage's product, for example. This is what that brand has defined as the key areas that they want to look into. Now, these can all be fully customized. So, if you're a B2B brand, you would have different issues here. You can work out what those key issues are for your particular brand or industry, define those, and we can have similar breakdowns here. What this means is you can just track on a week-to-week, day-to-day, even hour-by-hour basis if something is breaking, just how much these issues are being talked about. You can quickly see if the annual results published here have an overall impact on conversations, and they do. A lot of conversations around management and initiatives came as a result of these financial results. You can also see how these issues trend over time. So these little green and red arrows here just show you what percentage increase over the previous quarter these topics have had. And I think really interesting to see here a 225% increase around CSR. And we can click into this and actually understand all the individual articles that made up that particular spike. In this case, it's about businesses still continuing to do business in Russia, given the whole Ukraine war, and that's accounts for that big spike in content just there. Now, at the moment, we're looking at this globally, but you can filter this down just to your particular region. So if you wanted to have a look at how this is in the Netherlands, for example, you can see that we're now just pulling in content, primarily news stories in this case, that come from the Netherlands. So Dutch sources like foodclicks.nl, for example. Now, if, like me, you don't speak Dutch, you can translate all the articles into English or Dutch as well, if you'd like to see other languages translated into Dutch. So that way you just get a quick sense of what the article's about without having to go to it directly. Let's just go back to global and take a look at that picture there. We can delve into any of these categories here and get a full understanding of what's going on behind the scenes here. Each article, post that comes in has all the engagement metrics around it. So you can understand for news articles, for example, total number of Twitter shares and Facebook shares. So whilst this particular news article didn't get much attention on Twitter, it actually got nearly 300 Facebook shares and 6,000 Facebook likes, 2,000 comments. So a lot more active on Facebook here. You also have a little sentiment score as well. So the yellow, red, and green smiley faces just show you whether this piece is positive, negative, or neutral. And one really interesting feature that I think is always great to look at if you have had a crisis and you want to look back and understand what happened, what went wrong, how did this stuff go viral, is to have a look at our virality map. Now, what this does is if you have an online news piece or if you have a particular tweet or piece of content that goes viral, it just shows you exactly what happened. So in this instance, we're looking at a particular news article published on the 5th of March from the Washington Examiner. We've got the original piece of content just here, but you can see very quickly how there were 78 retweets and comments of this post. You can see over time how there were other spikes, these big circles here representing new mentions. So this piece actually continued to be shared for over a month. And each time that was a result of another newspaper article. And you can see how these newspaper articles generate more tweets each time. But similarly, they're also generating forum comments. So you can see the forum posts here. You've also got blogs being published linking back to this original post. So you can start to identify if there were certain inflection points, certain news articles, certain retweets that really made this issue go viral. And that really helps when you're kind of analyzing how a crisis took off and obviously planning for next time, which sort of sources you should be monitoring. You can also look at this through the lens of different countries. So again, with all media being global these days, issues aren't just kept within one particular market. So whilst a post might originate in the US, in this case, we start to see how that post then generated stories across the globe. In this case, we have this article here in the US, lots of engagement within the US itself, but it also spreads to Sweden, to the UK, Canada, for example, India. And you can just start to see again some of those key inflection points where that piece spread. What I think is really interesting is also to look at this through the lens of sentiment. So if there are, for example, and there are some here, a few people posting positively about this particular story, these could be some potential influencers or journalists that you might want to reach out to for further discussion, and really helps you in the heat of a crisis when things are really kicking off. But rather than just actual volumes of content, volumes of posts that are being published on these topics, it's important to look at the sentiment around these. So whilst you might have a lot of conversations around campaigns, advertising, I think it's really important to see here that the most negative topic that's being discussed in relation to this brand is around health issues. Health issues also comes bottom here in terms of what we call our net sentiments, that overall favorability rating to the topic. Again, you can click in here and just see all the particular posts. So conversations here around diabetes, sugar, and soft drinks, for example. But rather than going through every one of these posts, look at the top themes here to get a sense of some of the main keywords that are being mentioned. What I like to do is look at this by 2 hours. It gives you a little bit more context around the conversations rather than just those one word charts there. So again, you can see mentions around sort of cancer, diabetes, preventing disease, and so on and so forth. These are sorted by engagement overall, so you can just see the ones that have got most engagement. I think this is a great example here. So this is simply a reply from someone who has 160 Twitter followers, probably not someone you would normally be monitoring, but that generated 4,000 engagements. So it just shows you how very quickly someone with a small following can actually start to go viral and really impact the brand in a negative way. But I think another great way to sort this is actually by what we call our trending sort. And which piece of content are starting to actually go viral right now. So it's something that's great to check on a morning basis. You can just come in and understand either for your brand or as an industry in general, what are some of those posts that are just really starting to get lots of engagement right now, and you can get in there before they actually start to go viral. The sentiment key drivers is a great way to understand some of the top keywords, handles, hashtags that are being mentioned, either negatively for your brand or also positively. You can view this by top keywords like this, but also so either during a crisis or if you're looking back afterwards, you can now start to see, for example, what were some of those most negative hashtags that started to emerge. We've got boycott Coca-Cola, boycott Coke in relation to Russia here. And these are the conversations that you then really want to be adding into your monitoring. So you can start to see all those new conversations around these particular hashtags. At the other end of the scale, there could be some really positive hashtags here where people are defending the brand, are having good conversations. So also very important to monitor these and understand the conversations around those. You can see which posts are getting most engagement, which posts are going viral, but the ones that are getting most reach. So these could be big financial publications that are generating maybe not a lot of engagement, but also generating a lot of reach for the brand. Then have our theme cloud analysis here around key phrases. And this is really useful to get a sense of, again, what are some of the main conversations around the brand without having to go through all those individual posts and understand what's being talked about. And these are broken down by those key areas. So you can see this key phrases around things like financial performance, initiatives, so on and so forth. What I think is really interesting here as well is maybe finding some of those smaller stories. So if I look at financial performance, I see small bubbles coming up, inflation, future inflation, that doesn't necessarily come up in some of those bigger topics. Similarly, on the CSR front, there's some pretty positive stories here. So one around clean water. And whilst that is a positive story that you may have missed, it actually didn't generate much engagement at all. So really small numbers. But again, from a planning perspective, these are some sites that you might want to add to your list as ones that have previously written positively about your brand. And finally, we have the world map here, which is just great for getting a visual representation of where those conversations have been occurring. Again, the colors break them down by those individual areas. So you can quickly see there's conversations in Africa that are simply just about CSR and the initiatives the brand is taking there. But again, depending on your brand, you can create these custom breakdowns and then just understand what those conversations look like across either the global map, or you could also just deep dive within one particular market if your brand only operates in one country. And so with that, I'm going to stop the demo there. I'll hand back over to Minka and Igor to see if we have any questions. And again, apologies for the internet there. Hopefully it wasn't too much of a disruption, but I am back and I'll pop my camera back on, all being well.
No worries, no worries. Thanks, thanks, Sam. I appreciate the demo. So we do have 3 questions. So first of all, it's a little bit technical, is whether you can export to Excel the top teams, hashtags, sentiment drivers, and so on.
You can, absolutely. You can do that. You can build custom dashboards around it as well. So if you wanted to create, say, custom visualization for your management team, so they can kind of see something a bit more visually appealing, you can just create your own custom dashboards, alerts, reports, and have that there. But if you need the raw data as well, then you can do that, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And the other 2 are a bit more functional and a bit more businessy. So first of all, if the company wants to actually monitor a crisis, what information should they monitor first to prevent the crisis situation?
Yes, I think this goes back to the kind of the one of the slides I showed earlier, which is around what you should be monitoring on an ongoing basis. I think, crucially, your brand is the most obvious thing. So just make sure you're seeing absolutely everything about your brand. I think within that as well, people often forget that people spell brands wrong. So it's often worth adding in misspellings to your brand monitoring, just because people might get confused. They might spell it in the wrong way. It could be a typo. So just making sure you're kind of adding those in just means you're not missing anything. So tracking your brand obviously is I think the most important key thing. But then, as I mentioned, also tracking your competitors, tracking industry topics, just make sure that you're really being on top of all the conversation that's happening that might be relevant to you. But that's obviously going to be individualized and custom for each brand. A B2B brand is going to be looking at very different things to a B2C brand, for example.
Thank you. And I think on top of that, from my experience, I would also add that key stakeholders, especially for the public companies, are also very important. Such as
it's a great point, adding in execs, exactly.
The C-level that especially are having their own Twitter accounts and so on, that whose wrongful comments could potentially impact the publicity and the stock prices also are good to be added as a rule of thumb.
Absolutely.
And the last question we got is, how often do we need to update the crisis plan?
Good question. I think really as often as you can. I think as long as it's still relevant. Obviously, if a crisis does happen, you'll probably want to go and review what happened and review the plan there. But I think just as good practice, just making sure you always have, for example, your media lists updated. You always have the contact details of everyone ready. Just making sure that all the people who are on your list are still in place and aware of what's going on. So just making sure those basics are kind of constantly in place is really the essential thing.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Well, I do not see any more questions in the Q&A or in the chat box, but to our attendees, if there's anything else you want to know about Talkwalker or about actual functions of crisis management, do let us know. We still have a few minutes to cover it, and we'll be happy to advise you and share some best practices as well.
I don't think so. I will also share an email in the next few days with all our contact information. So if people have any questions, maybe they think of something they wanted to ask later, they can still send us the questions and we will get back to you.
Sounds great.
Thank you, Minka, and thanks, Sam, for the great presentation.
Thanks everyone for joining.
And thanks everyone for joining.
See you next time.
Have a good day and happy holidays, everyone.